Hello, welcome to this special edition of Left Up. I'm Marijam Didžgalvytė, and today I've got a lecture that I've given to the students at University of the Montfort for you guys. It will be all about way of thinking critically of esports and what it means to be a conscious producer. I'm not gonna lie, I have sadly lost the actual audio of this lecture. So I am going to be re-recording it, and it's probably going to sound slightly awkward because I'll be really trying to keep it as close as possible to how it was at the day. So I will also be introducing myself, etc. But yeah, it's just really to make you guys feel that you're actually there. So yeah, let's crack on. So hi everybody, thanks so much for having me. It is really great to see universities taking politics and labour issues more seriously. That's something that is quite new, I feel, and hasn't been done before, especially in the realm of esports. So who am I? I'm Marijam Didžgalvytė, and I am a freelance games journalist, content creator, trade union organizer. I'll come from a sort of more activist, artistic circles, but I've always gamed. I don't know, maybe it's an Eastern European thing. Always gamed, but always felt judged as well in the sort of lefty activisty circles. You know, there's really sort of a very narrow idea of what relaxing is meant to look like or what is meant to feel like. But things have really suddenly clicked for me in 2017 when that was the year when profits in gaming overtook the profits in the film industry. So, you know, it is now currently the largest cultural outlet there is, and still not many people see it as a political space, you know. So myself sort of coming from more of a fine arts background, and there's quite, I suppose, a rich tradition of trying to dissect what would fine art mean in the sphere of social change, and yet in gaming that's just not the case, whereas it's huge, it's bigger than films now. So yeah, it seems like a very ripe ground for a lot of interesting investigation. So yeah, only after further research did I start discovering that narratives in video games and communities around them can undoubtedly reproduce certain political affiliations. But I am sad to say that until very recently, those spaces have been allowed to be permeated by mostly right-wing, reactionary, conservative rhetoric. In part, I really think it is the left sphere of technology and sort of primitivism that is to blame. Gaming gets dismissed as this sort of waste of time activity or whatnot, and hence otherwise alienated individuals feel judged and immerse themselves into communities that they think will understand them. And those are rarely progressive, sadly. Well, I intend to stop these preconceptions. I want to convince the left of the game's potency in creating social change, and then perhaps attempt to reclaim this medium from the right altogether. So yeah, I've written for The Guardian now, Kotaku, Vice, gamesindustry.biz. I have a weekly show on Twitter and YouTube called Left Up, where we dissect politics and gaming. Been luckily published by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I'm very proud of that, and I've also been very lucky to be able to help out the new Game Workers Unite movement. I'm the chair of communications for the communications committee for the International. I'm a supporter at Game Workers Unite UK, which is now a legal trade union, which is very exciting. So yeah, I want to now start talking about, you know, what we'll be going into today. Now that you know what I'm sort of a bit more about. You guys are master students, so I'm not going to be afraid to really sort of, you know, throw quite intense thinkers at you. So we will be quoting, you know, Karl Marx and Walter Benjamin and Stuart Hall and Antonio Gramsci and Adorno. And so yeah, I think for you guys, I don't think basically they have been quoted in the context of esports, so I think it would be really interesting to begin to do that. So first of all, I wish to establish that politics actually even happen in esports. I think some of you may not necessarily think that's the case. It seems like such a neutral space, right? But it's not true. It is a space full of politics. It is a culture, and as such, it does require to be examined critically. And then I want to also think about where sports in general, because I think, you know, sports and esports, there is quite a very common history there. So I want to sort of think how sports were thought of by a lot of important 20th century thinkers and philosophers critically, and what did they have to say about such activity. And then I want to sort of really move into the stale aesthetics of esports. So I have this whole critique of the aesthetics of esports, because I think people think that they're neutral and they're meant to be, you know, inclusive and massive for everyone, but actually they are very, very set, and I think there's a history behind that, and that would be something quite interesting to dissect. And then, yeah, I really want you guys to think, because you will be the next generation of esports managers, of esports creators, and I think it would be really interesting for you guys to start thinking and questioning yourself as to what would it mean to be a conscious producer in esports. And in general, can esports ever be can they ever be utilized for a revolutionary function? I don't necessarily think they can be, actually, because of their modes of production. I think other cultural spheres don't necessarily have this problem. But yeah, I think it will be interesting for you guys to start thinking about these things, because that's just something that hasn't been discussed that much in this field. So yeah, let's get on with this. So yeah, first of all, I want to really kind of establish what politics in esports do actually happen and give you a few examples. This is the most obvious one. This is actually an excellent table that just shows how different players of different games have certain political affiliations, and that, yeah, again, so that's just games and politics in a very, very sort of basic sense. So as you can see, Overwatch players tend to be, you know, the way more of voters of the Democratic Party, and then, you know, Call of Duty players are way more into republicanism, etc. So yeah, this is just a sort of very, very basic, incredible table that just shows in a very, very I suppose basic level that politics and gamers and gaming communities certainly have I suppose a spectrum of opinions. So yeah, Overwatch tends to get higher interest in liberal markets. Call of Duty has the strongest correlation of any esports game with the political leaning altogether. StarCraft attracts bipartisan interest. Far Cry 5 attracts a more conservative audience. Then, you know, another whole issue to talk about is the fact that different governmental bodies getting involved with esports. You know, so South Korea has its own like esports department. That's clearly, obviously, politics. I do also want to talk about Olympics and esports, because although it just sounds like, you know, something down the pipeline at some point that will happen, but I think that's a huge area of political discourse that rarely gets covered even in the sports media. And if we wish to be conscious producers, then we should definitely be talking that in the context of esports. So a political problem that becomes apparent with the inclusion of esports into the Olympic events, which is already being thought of for like as close as 2022, is the creation of some superfluous nationalistic affiliations. It creates an unnecessary, purely artificial barrier in enjoying competitive gaming for audiences uninterested with the players' countries of origins. As it stands right now, teams are comprised of competitors from all over the world in esports. They create bonds that are based on chemistry, skill, and interests, not nationality. For a medium that utterly defies borders with online gaming, it seems completely regressive to now place such significance on the geographic placement of the players. In analog sports, one could argue that teammates have grown up in close proximity to each other, they had cultural affiliations, and that's what brought them together. In esports, though, borders don't exist. Palestinian and Israeli kids could be playing on the same League of Legends team. Russians and Ukrainians forming Quake Live channels. Mexicans and Americans making real relationships on World of Warcraft. You get the gist. Physical proximity only matters as to how far the servers can reach, not where one's passport gets checked. I'm certainly not advocating that the end goal for esports is Premier League-style format, but it is not a zero-sum game, and it's just something to really think about and dissect critically. Another problem with international esports Olympic Games is that every 4 years, entire communities get violently dispersed to make space for the Olympic stadiums. Billions of dollars of public money is passed on to private companies to build temporary buildings that rarely get used after the whole charade is over. Even the London Olympics in 2012, that were meant to be the most socially conscious ever Olympics, failed to create any sustainable engagement with the communities most affected by the event. Furthermore, because of the disability allowances, for instance, make the whole Paralympic Games project seem almost sinister. One of the silver linings from esports gaining the mainstream recognition, though, would be perhaps a push for establishing firm, unionized structures to deal with labor issues in the sector. Many professional gamers suffer from exhaustion, precarious contracts, early retirement with no social security and protection. Esports emerging on such a grand platform as the Olympic Games may shine the light on many shifty industrial practices that are currently common in the Wild West, that is competitive gaming. In order to expand on that, I want to, introduce you to where I think it was the first time that I heard of the terrible conditions in the realm of esports. Of course, I heard of the bunk beds and the camps of South Korea, but something that is a bit less discussed is the dependence of players to be playing in certain leagues. So this is the PEA scandal from about, I suppose, 2 or 3 years ago now. So in a heartfelt and informative open letter to Professional Esports Association PEA, the members of Cloud9, Counterlogic Gaming, Immortals, Team Liquid and Team Solomid have expressed their concern over being prevented from competing in ESL Pro League. Sir Scoots, who is the sort of, like a godfather of the Counter-Strike esports community in the whole world, wrote a letter expressing these concerns over the fact that these players are not allowed to be playing in different leagues. And Sean Gaz, who is one of the stars of that particular league, an esports player, signed it, and then he was singled out and fired. You can see the messages that were happening between Sean Gaz and his manager at the time on the right-hand side of the slide. The league later dissolved anyways, but soon after, the hashtag players' rights hashtag started trending on Twitter as the esports community received their first taste of good old union busting that is so commonplace in other workplaces, single out someone who was trying to organize and fire them. The bosses aim to break apart a solid body of unionized people in order to stop the momentum of demanding rights in the workplace. And esports tournaments are a workplace. Anyone thinking that playing video games and earning money is already a privileged position does not grasp the material history of leisure turning into labor. The vast majority of people's hobbies, cooking, arts, or physical sports, have already been turned into commodity industries, and as the biggest trend of entertainment in the world, gaming is no exception. I'm sure you all know of draconian contracts and terrible labor conditions in South Korea and elsewhere. Of course, another side of politics in gaming is the whole issue of representation, the fact that it is mostly young guy dudes, and so we should also be definitely talking about issues of inclusion in these spaces. So yeah, I think now that we have, you can see that politics in esports certainly happen, and that's, it's a space, it's not a neutral space, basically. Writer Will Parton has really put this in a very beautiful sense, but he was referring to the terrible shooting in an esports event in Jacksonville in August 2018 when he wrote this. Esports fans, by and large, don't see themselves as an especially political lot. Part of the appeal of esports for many has always been that competitive gaming offered an escape from everyday life, acting as a balm in a world that is now historically unkind to its young. Compelling though this fantasy is, it is still a fantasy. Esports is not separate from society, it is made by it. What happens there was always going to happen here, because everywhere is also here. So now we established that politics most certainly take place in esports, we need to look at the history of theorists trying to engage with that question on whether culture and sports in particular can ever have a revolutionary function, a value of where culture can be engaged in critically. Even though I have mentioned all these examples where politics happen in esports, is it even worth to try and improve it? Or are sports a fundamentally flawed medium that only enslaves us to the status quo? Would a complete rejection of competition be a more productive route? Well, Theodor Adorno would certainly think that way. one of the most prominent theorists of the so-called Frankfurt School, he was seen as completely enraged by sport politically. To be fair, he said the same about film, theatre, and most of fine art. We will find, though, that most of the criticism was purposefully too sharp, just to give space for an imagining of a utopia. But we'll get to it. The overall intellectual tenor of the Institute for Social Research in the University of Frankfurt in the 1920s was the elaboration of new and more subtle forms of Marxist thought, which would challenge the increasingly rigid and doctrinaire versions of Marxism being promulgated by the communist parties in Western countries at the behest of Stalin's Soviet Union. So, yeah, basically that's the sort of tradition that the Frankfurt School follows, and that's where Theodor Adorno's thoughts have come from. I cannot stress enough just how much I am quoting writer David Inglis here, who has written an excellent overview of Adorno's view on sports. Apologies. So yeah, very much I would recommend to read his text. In his written work, Adorno explicitly wishes to paint a picture of a ruinous dystopia characterized by control and domination. That's what he thinks of as sports in general. A key premise of his writing was that in the modern world, there is nothing innocuous left. In one way, the statement means that all aspects of modern society, no matter how apparently trivial, are implicated in the form of domination based around instrumental rationality which underpins that society. Even phenomena as harmless as games must therefore betray, in their very existence today, the marks of domination and unfreedom. As Adorno remarks, sport itself is not play, but ritual in which the subjected celebrate their subjection. Sport is now a brutalized form of activity that succeeds only in expressing the domination that underpins the rest of society. As a leisure activity, it stands in relation to the realm of work as do all other leisure activities. Free time is nothing other than a shadowy continuation of labor. Sport in late capitalism is elevated into the principle of life itself, whereby competitive struggles are adulated at a period of complete stasis. In this way, the tension in an earlier phase of capitalism between periods devoted to leisure and work is now dissolved in place of a repetitive sameness. The alienating conditions of life reduce relations between human beings to the good fellowship of the sporting community, where the latter is a perverted parody of the former. Not only on the field of play, but also among the audience of sporting events is this alienation made manifest. Sports, as well as all video games, may offer a sense of order and control, momentary recuperation and escape from the insecurity, inequality, and tension caused by capitalist systems, but these very same qualities also have a potential to trap the player within game spaces that are less about creative powers of play and more about soothing citizens' anxieties within sanctioned commercial leisure spaces. Workers with discretionary leisure income pay expert professionals efficiently to perform, in some cases to get injured on their behalf, helping to compensate for their boredom of their working lives. Jean-Marie Bromh sums up the tenor of what could be called the neo-Adornian school in sports sociology. Apart from the act of labor, the dominant and fundamental way a person relates to their body in state of capitalist society is through sport, inasmuch as it is through the model of sport that the body is understood in practice, collectively hallucinated, fantasized, imagined, and individually experienced as an object, an instrument, a technical means to an end, a reified factor of output and productivity, in short, as a machine with the job of producing the maximum work of energy. At a superficial level, the message expressed here that sports today are thoroughly permeated by domination and that they operate in the interests of the capitalist economy seems to be written in the spirit of Adorno's theory of sports and their relation to contemporary society. But in actual fact, sports' essence, and thus its potential in a possible future characterized by non-domination, is of play. That is a free and purposeless body activity enjoyed for its own sake. Adorno can be taken as holding that play is a form of activity which to a degree can stand beyond the realm of instrumental rational activity. Sport is seen to contain within it a utopia moment that looks forward to a time when humanity has escaped from the wills of instrumental reason and the forms of domination that are concomitant with it. Even today, video games hint at that possibility as well, played for their own sake rather than as a means to a repressive end, their non-instrumental nature is not yet realized. Unconsciously, they rehearse the right life. So only at this idea of spontaneous play is where Adorno gives sports a bit of breathing space. Adorno locates emancipatory potential in the slapstick and nonsense of farce, clowns, and circus performers, for their actions represent what is authentically human. Even in their most debased manifestations today, as the sports and entertainments of mass culture, games and buffoonery stand testimony of how life could be, free of domination and based around principles where actions are carried out autonomously for their own ends, beyond the realm of domination. Adorno's extravagantly negative statements on sports and other matters are in their excessive negativity quite explicitly designed as shock tactics, which are intended to compel the reader to think in ways very different from accustomed, and hence dominated, modes of thought. The ironic rhetoric exposes the utopian potential, while the utopian potential, the intuition that things could be different, is the very reason for denouncing the present in terms of negative overstatement. Far from holding a wholly derogatory opinion of sports, Adorno wants not only to criticize the contemporary debased forms in which sports are manifested in today's capitalist society, but also to valorize and defend the possible more free and liberatory types of sports and that could occur in a future society devoid of oppression and power. Again, I cannot stress enough how much of David Inglis's thoughts have really helped me in connecting these two strands of thought. So again, Jean-Marie Bromh reminds us that sport is dependent on the development of the productive forces of bourgeois society. Technical progress in sport closely follows the technological and scientific development of capitalism. Bourgeois sport is a class institution, totally integrated into the framework of capitalist production relations and class relations. Like other class institutions such as the university, the army, etc. Finally, as a phenomenon of the superstructure, sport is linked to all other superstructural levels of capitalist society. The organizational unity of sport is ensured by the repressive grip of the bourgeois state. Moreover, sport as ideology, transmitted on a huge scale by the mass media, is part and parcel of ruling bourgeois ideology. Sport in the capitalist society is represented as beyond redemption, and as with other bourgeois social institutions, can only be reclaimed by a proletarian revolution. Fuck yes. But yeah, so we have now sort of established that sport is something that it seems to be beyond saving, according to Adorno and other neo-Adornian thinkers. And yet, I will try and present a counter-narrative to that, and for that we arrive to the term cultural hegemony, and a lot of incredible Gramscian thought that it has been very, very inspiring in my own politics. So as described in the Columbia Encyclopedia, cultural hegemony is the domination of a culturally diverse society by the ruling class, who manipulate the culture of that society, the beliefs, explanations, perceptions, values, and mores, so that their imposed ruling class worldview becomes the accepted cultural norm, the universally valid dominant ideology which justifies the social, political, and economic status quo as natural and inevitable, perpetual and beneficial for everyone, rather than as artificial social constructs that benefit only the ruling class. So Antonio Gramsci is one of the key thinkers that basically formulates that rather than just critiquing and completely abandoning this field, as well as other fields of entertainment, we should be engaging in the push and pull of the cultural hegemony. He challenges this monolithic and determinist critique that I mentioned by emphasizing that power relations have to be sustained by more than brute force and economic domination. He argues, one cannot make politics history without a sentimental connection between intellectuals and people nation, without which their relationship becomes of a purely bureaucratic and formal order, and intellectuals a kind of caste or priesthood. Gramscianism therefore licenses critical analysts of sport to share with reservations the thrill of the sports stadium and the frisson of sports fandom. So yeah, he's basically saying we have to be there in the cultural spaces, otherwise alternative politics happen there. That is something that is very much echoed by contemporary cultural thinker Stuart Hall. He also understood popular culture as an ongoing process in which relations of control and subordination are constantly shifting, and certain cultural forms gain and lose support from institutions. Preferred of marginalized cultural content and forms are not fixed. According to Hall and Gramsci, there is a constant movement and interchange between them as a result of shifting power relations, the assimilation of popular content into high culture and vice versa. Hall retained faith that culture was a site of negotiation, as he put it, a space of give and take where intended meanings could be short-circuited. Popular culture is one of those sites where the struggle for and against a culture of the powerful is engaged. It is also the stake to be won or lost in that struggle, he argues. It is the arena of consent and resistance. He wasn't merely interested in interpreting new forms, such as film or television, using the tools that scholars had previously brought to bear on literature. He was interested in understanding the various political, economic, or social forces that converged in these media. It wasn't merely the content or the language of the nightly news or middle-bar magazines that told us what to think. It was also how they were structured, packaged, and distributed. If that is at all possible, really, how can we even, that is basically the question now is, are sports or esports, can they even have that sort of revolutionary function whilst they're still utilizing contemporary modes of production? So yeah, I have to throw a bit of Benjamin here. I think there's a difference between sports and esports, actually. You will see that in the future sentences. But Walter Benjamin's critique is very much interested in how cultural outlets or production of culture, how can it be conscious in terms of the sort of modes of production that it is utilizing. So the way that this relates to esports is, of course, its reliance on the products often made under appalling conditions in the global south. I'm thinking all of the gadgets and computers and consoles that we're having to use to enjoy esports. So in his text, author, producer, Frankfurt School theorist Walter Benjamin argues that it is not enough to pass something off as having revolutionary content while still utilizing contemporary relations to production. It is essential for the author, artivist, activist, or a gamer or games creator to become a conscious producer, one who considers and evaluates their own work and their relation to the formal means of production in a truly revolutionary way. I think another issue that esports have here in particularly is the fact that the code is always owned by companies, and at any time you're even playing a game, you're creating a profit for someone. So, analog sports don't necessarily have that issue. It's just a ball that can't really create a profit for anyone else. Whereas with esports, the fact that any code that anyone would be playing is already connected to certain material institutions, that is something that will always be an issue if we're going to try and prescribe revolutionary, revolutionary function to any form of gaming. So any product that has ethics at its selling point can never truly be valid if it negates conditions necessary for that product to exist. Furthermore, it risks appearing sinister if insisting on its value. So something to think about quite seriously here in terms of esports as an actually emancipatory activity. Because, again, like there are terrible, in order to get the minerals to even create our gadgets, there's nearly a genocide in Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm not even talking about the terrible conditions that the workers in Foxconn factories in China have to endure. So yeah, again, that's sort of an issue that other cultural means don't necessarily suffer from, but in terms of esports, needs to be something to be thought about. So now, we established sort of all the really big and fundamental issues with esports and some sort of progressive agenda. But even beyond that, I just want to also really, again, because you guys will be the next generation of esports makers, I want to sort of inspire you to think about the aesthetics of esports in a different way, because As it is a very aesthetically poor field, I'd say. So here, look, I typed in esports into Google, and these were the images that came up. Isn't that really sad? They all look the same. It's just the poverty of aesthetics, as I call it. And I think that's something it just seems to me that it's a very uninspiring field right now, but it could be so much more interesting. So while the in-game characters and players themselves are increasingly diverse, the way we choose to present our competitions continues to be incredibly homogeneous. From uniforms to stage design, stream editorial choices, music, sponsors, casters, the ruling aesthetic mimics those non-digital sports, just with an added layer of pubescent scent, plastic, and neon lights. For an entertainment strand so varied and so full of distinctive personalities and traditions, it is regrettable to see it reduced to a hyper-capitalist image of dubstep, energy drinks, boot babes, and adverts. The purpose of any representational imagery is to spell out the kind of interest and fulfillment that activity can offer the viewer. In esports, rarely does such imagery differ from game to game or according to its audience. The viewer's pleasures are assumed to be concrete and unchanging. While at the dawn of esports phenomena such uniformity was acceptable, it is now presenting limitations and, dare I say it, utter boredom. According to philosopher Wolfgang Welsch, from ancient times, sport was praised as demonstrating and realizing the domination of the body by the mind and will, profane triumph of the metaphysical conception. Man was to be governed by mind, and to do this, had to subjugate the body's weakness and desires. Sport was to discipline the body and to make it fit to support the mind and its ends. It's difficult to attach an aesthetic to such a concept, and the current images of both analog sports and electronic sports are a carefully curated affair that is far from being neutral. While esports tournaments organizers believe that the artistic choices in their events are those that will attract the maximum popularity, a false universality that doesn't fit in the context. It is simply the status quo that is being provided, reproduced, not some well-researched, nuanced approach as how best to showcase skill, speed, and grace. There is a particular joy in spectating an athletic event, the participatory thrill, the communal experience, but the outfit in which such events are wrapped is often exclusionary and directed at a very limited audience. Certainly, promotion and generation of income for multinational corporations such as Blizzard, Entertainment, Riot Games, and Valve has become the primary function of esports, but the grassroots esports communities have always been bending the expectations of how such scenes must look. The infantilization of esports at a professional level is a deliberate choice, but I am becoming less and less convinced that it's even profitable for that much longer. Localized stories, exploration of cultural differences and diversity are no longer seen as exercise in losing capital. Overwatch, Fenty Beauty, Teen Vogue, and Wonder Woman have all proven that expanding the reach of a product certainly brings in monetary rewards. New kinds of representation create new communities and ways for people to relate to one another. And for me, that gives them a possible relation to a politics. Now, I also agree that diversity is also a great tool for capitalism and can be very convenient for it. So this is not some sort of anti-capitalist utopia for sure, but it's just something to just think about and expand in this realm. Consider the contrast in presentation between dressage and weightlifting, for instance. These sports are watched by different audiences and require distinctly curated methods to demonstrate skill, the athlete's stories, and to communicate context into which the sport was born. No such care is currently given to esports. The tone and environments hardly differ between Hearthstone and StarCraft, FIFA, and Counter-Strike. That feels very odd. As with the growth of esports phenomena, viewers watching those tournaments come from increasingly divergent backgrounds and seek contrasting experiences. Now, this next slide is empty, and it is not by mistake that it is such so, but basically want to just throw quite a few visual cues at you, and I want you to just imagine those and connect them with how esports could be. While traditional sports limit the presentation to the admiration of an athletic body, esports have no such boundary. Creative solutions, intellect, as well as reactions provide a rich tapestry from which to borrow visual cues. So yeah, now close your eyes perhaps and just think. Esports and cups of tea, flash mobs, grime, lasers, beach, a fireplace, Lil Peep, grudge matches, Oprah interviews, post-rock, charismatic casters, manifestos, Tom Ford suits, house sessions, red wine, chicken cottage, highlands, Alexander McQueen dresses, red carpet, nectar card, tributes, tweed. So many undiscovered aesthetic tropes that could be used. Esports have come a long way from its humble beginnings in the arcades. It is now $1 billion industry and is likely to grow further. Esports could be a proud demonstration of pushing bodily limits, a celebration of one's objective achievements. At this moment, though, this great source of entertainment is increasingly lacking creativity and impact. It is not true that esports have not found its identity yet. It's just that the prevailing identity is quite lazy and monolithic. And yet, what could it mean to create an actually counter-hegemonic esports object? So here in the UK, this counter-hegemonic culture can be identified in explicitly anti-fascist football clubs like Clapton CFC. So they are community run, they also help out a lot to people living around the area of the stadiums. It is all very sort of horizontally led, so its modes of production are on point. Everything is in-house, even the sort of shirt making, etc. So, perhaps we can expect a similar type of theme in esports soon. Only by combining our activism with popular entertainment can we begin to challenge the set of liberal trends that tend to ignore the threats that can so easily begin to take shape. The progressive technophobia, primitivism, and general judgment has allowed unsavory politics to take root in gaming, and we must explicitly challenge that. Our politics don't have to be preachy, they have to be fun. How great would it be if esports could be at the forefront of that? You see, to think critically is to identify and exploit certain cultural pockets, build a radical counterculture within the shell of the old society, and wage the struggle for a new cultural hegemony.